The Bible was written thousands of years ago. Sometimes, when it's read today, there are parts that don't seem to make sense. These videos are about how the Bible does make sense, when time is taken to look more closely. In the Bible, especially the Old Testament, there are a lot of lists of people. Spend enough time reading those lists, and it's hard to resist trying to count the exact number of years that have elapsed since the time of Adam and Eve. However you wind up counting, it usually ends up being thousands of years. Ask a scientist about how long the Earth has been around, though, and the answer's different. Whether it's a geologist explaining how old our rocks are, or an astronomer speaking about how galaxies, stars, and planets formed long ago, they're going to talk about numbers in the billions with a B. Is it possible to reconcile what's written in the Bible with well-accepted science? As it turns out, the Bible doesn't state exactly how long ago the entire universe, Earth included, was created. Take time to understand the way the book of Genesis read in its original language, and there are a couple things which can be clearly understood. Depending on the exact version of the English Bible available, the first few sentences of the Bible say something like,
"At the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was waste without form, and it was dark on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving on the face of the waters."
At which point the book of Genesis begins to explain God's steps to set up the world for people. We're going to come back to these opening phrases later, but for now, be sure to recognize one important thing. There is a particular word in the original text for created, and it is used here at the very beginning of the Bible. It has a specific meaning related to bringing something new and unique into existence, as opposed to fashioning something out of materials that already exist. Now, as the first few chapters of Genesis describe how God puts things together, the phrase, "Let there be light," will stand out as familiar to many. In fact, God speaks much of his work into action this way. The phrase, "and God said," is repeated over and over as he puts the world into order. God is described as making some things, forming some things, speaking things into being, but he does remarkably little actual creating. There are only two other new and distinct things that God creates in Genesis. One is a new kind of life called nephesh in Hebrew, or soul in English, that exists in all the creatures of the earth like fish, birds, mammals, and reptiles. Later, when he makes humans, he puts that same kind of life, a soul, inside the body before it is considered a living thing. And then God creates something else new and different, especially for people. No other creatures have it. That's a whole other topic in and of itself, but it's worth realizing that a lot of what God makes in Genesis during what are typically referred to as the 6 or 7 days of creation is actually just reordering something that already existed from his original act of creation in the very first phrase of the Bible. It's time to come back and consider the opening lines of Genesis, because at first it sounds like God made a pretty poor universe, chaotic and disordered. It turns out, though, that God didn't set things up as formless waste during that very first creation. Again, looking at the original language here helps make things clearer. First, it should be understood that the Hebrew language would look to an English reader like a series of run-on sentences with no capital letters or punctuation, and it was up to readers of that time to understand where thoughts began and ended. So those original phrases would look more like this. There's no way to know exactly how much time transpired over the course of those phrases. However, one small but important word provides some critical context that often goes missed in English translations. In the phrase, "and the earth was waste without form," the word "was" should actually be the word "became," indicating that creation was not originally disorganized or chaotic. Something must have happened to cause this change, and some amount of time must have transpired. Let's put all these pieces together. By looking at the original language to understand when God actually brings about something new and unique, it's apparent that over the course of time there is more than one act of creation. It's quite possible that other kinds of life on Earth could and did come before whatever event turned the very first creation chaotic and disorderly. And there's no indication in the Bible of how much time passed before that happened or between that and when God started putting things back together. When he did reorder the world over the course of the 6-day time period most folks have heard about, he did so using the stuff that was already around and also created something new and different in creatures and in humans. In other words, the clock on the age of creation didn't reset after Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, so there's no reason that scientific methods of determining Earth's age don't jive with what is recorded in the Bible. So how old is the world? Really old. The Bible doesn't state it exactly and doesn't disagree with the best estimates provided by scientific methods, which brings up another question: why does this matter? Well, if you're already a devout believer and you're faced with something from science that seems to contradict what you believe, take a second look at the Bible to make sure you understand that belief correctly. And if you don't believe the Bible because you think it doesn't match up with research or reality, you may also find it worth your while to see what the book really has to say when taking the time to properly understand it.